Hey guys, Jason here, back with another TCG Extended deck profile. Today's feature deck is one of our favorite archetypes across all of Duel Masters, and it was a key inspiration for Season 3, it's Wave Strikers. As you can see, the big card Wave Strikers get from set 13 is Trombo Fractured Doll. I feel like I say this way too much, but it's honestly such a shame that Trombo never made its way over to the TCG, because it's such a well-designed card. I think most communities are in agreement that light, dark, fire nature is the correct way to play Wave Strikers in the 2005-6 format, and I think having this Civ combination makes it a very interesting deck. Having 4 Civs and the 40 card limit of course makes the deck incredibly challenging and oftentimes frustrating to build, but there's a strangely perverse sense of fun when building decks like this. Anyway, that's enough intro from me, let's jump in. Starting with the 2 drops, we are running max copies of Merly the Oracle and max copies of Uncanny Turnip. These are no-brainers. Wave Strikers activate their abilities by having multiple Wave Strikers out, so we want to play them as early as we can. These 2 are just the best 2 drops, so max copies of each makes sense. Merly especially is what we want to open with, since it can somewhat police the field, and its Wave Striker ability can be activated while it's already on the field, unlike Turnip, which needs to be played from the hand. The other 2 drop we're running is of course the new addition Trombo. Unlike many of the OCG lists from this era, however, we are running 4 copies. At first glance, this might seem questionable because Wave Striker players aren't looking to use Trombo's effect so many times in a game. Well, the main reason we run max copies of Trombo is actually because we want to have the option to summon it on turn 2. I did say Merly was the ideal play, but we can't expect to open with Merly all the time, and if given the choice to play Turnip or Trombo on 2, I would rather play Trombo. Turnip and Trombo are both technically able to +1 off their Wave Striker abilities, but because of the zones they interact with, Turnip's +1 effect will be live more often than Trombo's. Turnip is also the only come-into-play draw card in the deck, so to speak, so as much as we can, we want to have access to that in the later turns. Moving along the curve, our very familiar 3 drops are the 4 copies of Sapient Tark Flame Dervish, and 3 copies of Azra Vizier of Safety. Sapient Tark is just so good, and it is the reason I feel like Wave Strikers need to play Fire. When Wave Striker abilities are active, he can just lock the opponent's board and stop them from playing the game. He is held back by the relatively low fire presence in the deck, which I largely attribute to the limited TCG card pool. Azra is another great 3 drop. It's not quite as good as Sapient Tark on turn 3, but it's not a bad consolation prize, and it certainly has its own merits. Just having a big body is already pretty good, but in such an aggro-heavy format, the blocker ability really comes in handy. We originally ran 2 copies, but felt a 3rd was necessary, both from the perspective of having more 3 drops and having an extra blocker. I'd actually love to fit in a 4th, but as I will utter many times this video, would love to, but no space. This time around, we made the difficult decision to cut Bronze Arm in favor of just playing Wave Strikers every turn, so the curve jumps a little bit. The next cards I'm going to talk about are our 3 copies of Jagila the Hidden Pillager and 1 Mr. Hazaria Duke of Thorns. The big change here is having cut down from 4 to 3 Jagila. It was a tough decision because we love Jagila, and it often feels like the card that most frequently decides games. But when we tested 4 copies, we found that it frequently popped up, oftentimes in situations where we would have preferred something else. I definitely see the value in running max Jagila, and I would love to run 4, but because space is limited, we're trying to get away with 3 copies. The main reason we cut a Jagila was because we wanted to squeeze in Hazaria, who wasn't in the original list. Hazaria being a turn 4 play and having an instant gratification effect is really nice. It's one of the most clutch cards in the deck, and it has some sweet interactions with Soul Swap and Miraculous Rebirth, which I'll talk about later. It also happens to be our only 4-drop target for Rebirth, and we'd love to play a second, but again, no space. Speaking of cards that went from 4 to 3, Mysterious got the Jagila treatment. When we first made the deck, we started with Max Mysterious, and I was very hesitant about cutting one because the deck already doesn't have a lot of draw. But I was able to rationalize cutting down on Mysterious because we aren't too reliant on hitting it early, so the lower count is fine since we have more turns to find it. The format being aggro heavy also means we don't need to lean on it as much, because we at least get cards from our shields being broken anyway. Unlike Jagila, whose change from 4 to 3 felt like a necessary compromise, cutting down to 3 Mysterious actually feels really good, because it doesn't clog up our hands anymore, and the deck still has enough ways to pull it out late game. On the subject of searching for Mysterious, one of the ways we can do this is through our 2 copies of Miraculous Rebirth. So yes, Miraculous Rebirth finally makes its way into the deck after we embarrassingly left it off the TCG revamped deck profile. Rebirth works very nicely in Wave Strikers because it is pretty much the only low maintenance advantage generating card in the deck. It removes an opposing creature and most of the time lets us summon a Wave Striker from the deck. The search usually results in a big swing, and some strong applications include grabbing a 5-drop, grabbing Hazaria for a double kill, and summoning Sapient Tark, which, given the nature of the deck, isn't the easiest thing to do. But the card isn't just sunshine and rainbows. As neat as the colors are, being multi-civ very much acts as a double-edged sword. On one hand, charging Rebirth on turn 1 pretty much sets up the mana requirements for the rest of the game, which is phenomenal. But on the other hand, hitting an expensive multi-civ card in a deck without ramp and reliable draw while trying to play stuff on curve feels horrible. We actually started out with 3 copies, and many other TCG-style Wave Striker decks run 4, but we cut it down to 2 because it kept bricking us when we top-decked it. Ultimately, we determined that playing roulette for mono-civ fire or nature was the lesser evil when compared to the moderate risk of bricking from a Rebirth top deck. To finish off with the creatures, the boss monsters of the deck are the 2 copies of Kilstein Nebula Elemental and 1 cheeky copy of Cryptic Totem. Kilstein is of course the big boss of Wave Strikers, and I do think it's considered a Wave Striker staple at this point. Because of its cost, I briefly thought about cutting down to 1 copy, but I decided against it because Kilstein just has the power to solve so many situations. I will admit that Kilstein is a card with some shortcomings, but it also has tremendous upside, so much so that we feel that it doesn't make sense to run fewer than 2. Cryptic Totem is a new addition to the deck, and it's a card that I think should have been in our Wave Strikers list from the beginning. If you've ever played Wave Strikers, the thought of "I have a giant board of jacked up creatures but I'm still scared to break" has probably crossed your mind a few times. For this reason, I think Cryptic Totem is perfect for Wave Strikers, because building an obnoxiously big board and not attacking is what they're all about. The extra insurance Cryptic provides when closing out games has made a very noticeable difference, and we're really happy he's in the deck. To finish things off, keeping in line with tradition, our shield triggers are 4 copies of Soul Swap, 2 copies of Terror Pit, and 3 copies of Tornado Flame. Soul Swap is a key enabler of the deck in that Soul Swap does Soul Swap things. Most of the time, we're putting a Turnip or Trombo into the mana zone to cheat out Jagila, Kilstein, or Cryptic Totem, but it of course can be used in a multitude of other ways. It also works as a defensive trig, and one of our favorite interactions is using Soul Swap to bring Kilstein into the battle zone if the opponent breaks into it, and of course we have enough mana. The swing it causes is just really funny, and it makes us feel like we're in an anime. As for the Terror Pits and Tornado Flames, there are 2 key reasons for why we run them. One is to pad out our shield trigger count, since I don't think Wave Strikers can beat aggro without shield triggers, and the other is to have them serve as mana fodder for Darkness and Fire. We might occasionally need to remove a problematic creature, but in general, they're not really meant to be hardcasted. My philosophy here was to just include mono-civ cards with decent utility, thereby giving us enough confidence to charge every turn and retain the ability to play stuff on curve. Even in an unfavorable scenario where we aren't playing the ideal Wave Striker on curve, we probably can still make another decent play if we have enough available mana. Here's a nice bird's eye view of the deck. We designed this deck with the intent of playing Wave Strikers every turn to get the abilities online as soon as possible. I would say there is a lot of variance in how games play out because of how Wave Striker decks are constructed, but in general, we typically want to play Merly or Trombo on 2, Sapient Tark or Azra on 3, a 3-drop or Uncanny Turnip on 4, and then Jagila or Mysterious on 5. Then, the deck does the typical Wave Striker thing of building a giant board while waiting for the boss cards. In terms of matchups, Wave Strikers this time around are unfortunately plagued by the same problems they've always had, despite the consistency boost from Trombo. For example, control-centric strategies like discard and removal still give this deck a lot of trouble. On the subject, this deck especially hates Judgment. Even with the Merly boost, the deck runs so many weak creatures that a single Judgment can take Wave Striker abilities offline. And while not confined to controlled playstyles, the advent of Spiral Gate in our format has been very unkind to Wave Strikers. I don't think Wave Strikers are overwhelmingly favored against anything in Season 3, but they do have some very compelling matchups, especially against rush decks. I think it can bully a lot of aggro decks given a good enough start, but I would say its most notable matchup is being slightly favored against the Outlier, which is one of our best decks this format. Merly is the MVP in that matchup because it can police the 1-drops and it puts Azra out of Comet Missile range. In terms of other options, Bronze Arm Tribe is a card that I kind of miss having in the deck just because of how much I appreciate the mana ramp. I already spoke at length about Miraculous Rebirth, but I think the card has its advocates, so I'll talk about it some more. I don't think I'd play more than 2 in this current build, but I think there could be merit in reconfiguring the deck to include a thick lineup of Bronze Arm and Rebirth. So perhaps the curve could be designed in such a way where you aim to hit a 2-drop Wave Striker on 2, Bronze Arm on 3, Mysterious or another Wave Striker on 4, and then always Rebirth on 5. Lastly, there's a lot of tinkering that can be done with the Wave Striker lineup. I already mentioned wanting extra copies of Azra, Jagila, and Hazaria. I also think that Flame Trooper Goliath and Eviscerating Warrior Lumez are interesting picks. At the moment, we find Flame Trooper a bit too slow and Lumez a bit too situational, but it's possible we just haven't found the right build for them yet. And for the TCG loyalists, here's a version of the deck that only uses cards from the global release. You can also consider this list the updated version of our Wave Strikers deck all the way back from TCG Revamped. Compared to the list from this video, I took out the Trombos for the 2 Morbid Medicines, the 4th Azra, and the 4th Jagila. Now, Morbid Medicine is a card that we admittedly slept on for a really long time. I think Morbid Medicine is a great fit for Wave Strikers in particular because it is technically a +1, and even though Wave Strikers can't run cards like Energy Stream, at least in this current form, you can think about Morbid Medicine as a pseudo-energy stream, as if you're drawing cards from the graveyard, and I think that's pretty cool. It's one of the few true advantage-generating cards that Wave Strikers in the TCG have access to. The 4th Azra was put in because we lost a lot of early drops in the Trombos, so I thought Azra could help with that, especially since we did want a 4th copy anyway. And, well, the 4th Jagila is because we like Jagila very much. I think this could be seen as the flex spot of the deck. You could maybe put in another Hazaria, but Jagila is who we're going with. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed our latest coverage of Wave Strikers. I'm just really happy to finally see Trombo in the deck because he totally belongs in it. And to be honest, I feel like we could bring this deck with Trombo into the TCG and it would be totally fine. But on a separate note, I'm curious to know what you guys think about the best way to build Wave Strikers. Do you think it's better to just build it in such a way where you play Wave Strikers every turn? Or do you think there's some merit in building a Bronze Arm Rebirth focused version of the deck like I talked about earlier? Or maybe none of the above? Anyway, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.